I want to take a look now at post-World War II Soviet Union. And we're going to see a lot of things changing here, and eventually we're going to see the decline and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But the way things were after World War II is that there were two superpowers that emerged: the Soviet Union, USSR, and the United States, USA. These two powers will basically be the two powers by which the entire world will, almost the entire world, will come to line up behind either the East or the West, either the US or the Soviet Union. That's where you would get your money, you get your weaponry, it's where you would get your economic aid. Well, part of the problem, of course, with the Soviet Union is that the promises of Karl Marx for a utopia, he had promised a utopia that would come, that there would be this transition period, and then we would see a utopia emerging where the workers would, run things, everybody would be equal, everything would be peaceful, and so forth. This was never and has never been realized, certainly not in the Soviet Union. We're going to talk about some of that and what happens with that. This cartoon that's here sort of relates to a joke. There was a lot of Soviet jokes. We're not going to tell many of them here, but there was one joke during the Soviet era where they'd say, comrade, you know what capitalism is. It's a system involving the exploitation of man by man. To which the answer would be, socialism is the other way around. So you can think about it, see if you think that's funny. But basically what they're trying to say is it doesn't work. And this little cartoon says it. See, rejoice, comrade, we have solved income inequality. Yeah, we are all poor. Nobody has anything. That's the basic idea here, I guess, of what we're talking about, why communism failed. It was very common in the Soviet Union to have very long lines at every store, and then even in those stores to have very few items inside for sale, very few things of variety. You would just line up and get whatever they had that day, and it could take you hours. So this is part of the problem. The problem is without incentive, why work harder? Why do more if you have no opportunity to gain more? I'll just do the minimum that I'm forced to do, and everyone else starts doing the same. Well, let's take a look then at Stalin. He is the guy who certainly will come to power after Lenin, and who rules the Soviet Union with an iron fist for many years. Stalin lives from 1878 to 1953, and he rules the Soviet Union from 1924 to 1953. So you can see just about 30 years, and taking through World War II and up, of course, into the Cold War era. Lenin was the one who had brought about the communist revolution in Russia. Lenin had ruled Russia from 1917 to 1924. And as he got older, he began to have problems, health problems. One of those is he had a stroke. And Stalin was one of his right-hand men, although there were some others. And once Lenin dies, there's a lot of maneuvering to see who would take over. Lenin was so loved, and still revered, that his body was not buried as he had requested next to his mother, but was mummified, was actually preserved, and put on display in a glass-covered case in Red Square. And it's still there today. If you go to Red Square, you could line up to see the mummified remains of Lenin. Well, Lenin has a stroke in 1922, and a lot of things happen then. His wife, Lenin's wife, begins to serve as a kind of proxy for him. Stalin begins to position himself to take over. Other people do, including the guy pictured here, Trotsky. What Stalin was very good at doing was isolating all of his rivals and eliminating them. Now, it doesn't mean they were all killed, but they were, some of them exiled, some of them sent off to prison for a while, and that sort of thing. One of his main rivals was Trotsky. Trotsky had become a war hero during the Russian Revolution. He was the war commissar. You know, he was out with the troops, and the troops grew to love him, and many of the people did too. But he and Stalin, of course, did not get along, and they did not agree on details of how all this should happen. And so eventually Stalin decides that Trotsky is so loved that he wouldn't kill him, but he would exile him. And so he was exiled to Turkey first. Then he ended up in France for a little while. Nobody knew what to do with him. Nobody really wanted him. They didn't really trust him. So in Turkey, they put him on an island and isolated him there. And then he finally thought he might get a better deal somewhere else. He went to France. He went to Paris, and they didn't want him in Paris. They sent him off to a little village. He went to Norway for a while. Finally, the Norwegians decided they had to get rid of him. They put him on a freighter to Mexico. And he lived for several years in Mexico, around Mexico City. And there he was writing books critical of Stalin, critical of things that were going on in the Soviet Union. And Stalin decides that he should be eliminated. So he sends assassins at various times to try to kill him. Trotsky gets bodyguards that are surrounding him all the time. But eventually a guy sneaks in 1940 and uses a kind of ice hammer, it's called, and bludgeons him. He doesn't die right away, and when his guards come running in the room, they're beating the guy. They're gonna probably beat him to death. And Trotsky says, "Leave him alive so we can have sort of the evidence of how this happened." Trotsky dies a couple days later by the orders of Stalin. So we can see Stalin is quite brutal, very controversial, and that's not only with people like Trotsky; it's with regular people as well. I thought you might like to see this. This is Lenin lying in state. You can see him kind of in a glass case, coffin, whatever you want to call it. And there's a big monument out front. You know, people line up to go see it. But his face is, you know, his body has been preserved, and it has a team of people that keeps it still today in great condition. So there he is, looking pretty good for being dead for so long. But they maintain this, and in fact, I was reading this team actually went to preserve the bodies of other communist leaders like Ho Chi Minh, and the dictators of North Korea also call upon this team to preserve their bodies. And, you know, here's one thing you might want to think about. How about a Lenin cake? Yeah, I couldn't believe this when I found it. Here is a life-size replica of Lenin made as a cake. And so you can see these young ladies here very interested in trying to get a little more of Comrade Lenin's cake. So you might want that for your next party, right? Well, post-World War II USSR, Stalin, you know, part of the problem was the Soviet Union, Lenin had forced the revolution. Karl Marx had said that the revolution would come when the workers would unite and that they would overthrow things, a revolution, take over the means of production and so forth. Problem was in the Soviet Union, they didn't really have any production, had very little industry, very few factories. It was agriculturally based. And so the revolution of Lenin was not a pure Marxist revolution because really it, I guess, was too soon or in the wrong place. It didn't stop him. But what it meant was that the Soviet Union was far behind the West, the Europeans and the United States when it came to being industrialized. Stalin is going to address this in 4 5-year plans, okay, and especially the first 5-year plan is probably the most important. This was a means to try to bring about economic change, industrialization in the Soviet Union. So what was his plan? His plan was to use what they had, and they had a lot of farmland and a lot of farmers. But these farms were small, and the farmers ran their farms, as you might imagine, planting their own crops, harvesting their crops, and so forth, taking them to market. Stalin industrialized farming. He made collective farms because he wanted to control all of it. So he basically took over all the farmland. He tore down all the fences and all that kind of stuff. And they made huge collective farms where these farmers would no longer own the land, have their own farm. They would just be farming huge fields, and all the crops and so forth would be controlled by the government. They would be sold, much of it. In fact, most of it was sold to places like the United States and Europe and so forth. And then the money from that was used to buy the equipment and things they needed to industrialize. So the collective farms then were to provide profits to build up industry. Part of the problem was, of course, these collective farms, the farmers did not sit well with them. They lost their farm, and now they just work in a big collective field, and they don't control anything. Plus the fact that Stalin was selling so much of it, there wasn't enough to feed the people. So all this leads to a famine and great starvation of the people. But in the end, Stalin is able to industrialize the Soviet Union much more quickly through these harsh means. Now, when World War II comes, at first, Stalin makes a non-aggression pact with Hitler, because I think he knows he's not ready to fight Hitler yet. And so that comes. But of course, eventually when the war begins, the Soviet Union sides in with England and France, and eventually the United States to fight against Germany. But Soviet Union had more losses of life than any other country, because a lot of the battles were fought on its land, very harsh conflicts, and they lost cities like Stalingrad and others were just destroyed. So they lost estimates about 30 million people died in World War II, very heavy losses. After the war, of course, Germany is defeated. Hopefully you remember that. And the Soviets are going to have a very harsh peace on their side, whereas the United States initiates the Marshall Plan that would rebuild, for example, Germany, western part of Germany. Since Germany is divided into 2 parts, east and west, and the east part goes to the Soviet Union, the west part's divided between France, England, and the United States, and eventually that is unified together as West Germany. But in the East German side, the Soviets want to make the Germans pay. And so, in fact, they take goods, materials. They even take apart German factories, literally take them apart, and load them onto trains, and with the equipment and all the material, and they rebuild them on Soviet land. They bring Germans to train them how to run it, and so forth. So instead of building up East Germany, they're basically taking whatever they can get out of Germany, East Germany, to try to build up their economy. Throughout this, Stalin exploits the workers and works them very long hours for very little amount of food and so forth. And since so many men had died in World War II, many of those workers that replaced them, about 40% were women, replacing the men lost in World War II. And so for these women, you'd have both the man and the woman working. Then when the woman would get home, of course, she'd still be expected to take care of everything at home. So some people called this a double shift, right? Shift in the work in the factory, a shift at home. And then, of course, normally the women had to wait in the long lines to get the food and whatever goods they could get. Might have to do an hour or two a day just to get enough food to feed the family. But through all this, even though it was harsh on the people, the production of the Soviet Union did grow. Now, as we said, after World War II, there emerges these superpowers, the U.S. and the USSR. And part of the reason for this is the fact that Western Europe had been so damaged by the war, and they had colonial powers. For example, England had colonies all around the world. France had colonies in many parts of the world, and so forth. But with World War I, the Depression, and World War II, colonial institutions like that had declined. It's hard to keep their power there. And so the United States definitely emerges as a superpower. This begins actually with World War I, but certainly is sealed with World War II. And the Soviet Union, which comes about during World War I and then rapidly industrializes by World War II, will also be the other superpower. So these two then will come to control things. Now, one of the things that had happened will happen is that the Soviet Unions get a block of land in Eastern Europe. You see the map that's on the screen here. You can see the really dark red part is Russia. Then you can see Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and so forth, Ukraine. Those were all annexed into Russia. And then these other territories here that are a lighter shade were basically satellite countries that were communist and basically under the control of the Soviet Union for the most part. And so they gain a lot of territory in Eastern Europe. Stalin wanted this, he called it as a buffer state, because he said, well, we think the West is going to invade us. This way, if the West is going to invade us, they're going to have to go through East Germany, Poland, and so forth before they get to us. But you have to remember the Soviet Union had a huge empire, which included not only Eastern Europe, but the Balkan states, and the Balkan states are down in this area of Bulgaria, Albania, Romania, and so forth, and over in Eastern Asia that oftentimes we don't talk about, but areas that they had taken from the Japanese, the islands to the north up here, the Kuril Islands. Right after the war, they took over Manchuria from the Japanese, and of course took control of North Korea. Eventually, North Korea will become independent, although highly influenced by the Soviets and later the Communist Chinese. And in China, communism grows, and nationalistic China is basically pushed off to Taiwan. And so the Soviets will have a partner here in Asia, and a lot of influence there as well. Okay, so their influence has greatly grown. They have a huge empire, which makes them strong in one sense. Take a look at all these areas here, just north of India. These are all these Stan countries, I sometimes call them. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and so forth. But a lot of these territories in the purple here are controlled by the Soviet Union. Those are there. Now, This could be seen as a strength. They certainly have a lot of land, a lot of resources. Of course, they also have lots of ethnic groups, lots of people that eventually are going to want their own country, speak their own language, have a different religion. You know, the Soviet Union is dominated by Russians who are either, I guess, atheistic communists or Russian Orthodox Christians. But you find, all different languages and cultures around. So we'll talk more about that later. This maybe makes it a little bit clearer in this map. You can see Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and so on. So you got all those territories. This is showing after the Soviet Union collapses, these become independent countries. But these were all part of it. The Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, all these areas here. So these are all the territories, and it's a huge area. Actually, Russia is one of the largest countries in the world. Well, Stalin, to keep control, used secret police. His secret police, there were hundreds of thousands of them. Many years ago, I was in Eastern Europe while it was controlled by the Soviets. And while I was there, I noticed everybody had really, not very good cars. They had these little tiny, they were called Skodas at the time. They're sort of a Fiat, a cheaply made Fiat. Of course, Fiat's already pretty cheaply made. A cheaply made Fiat that only came in 2 doors or 4 doors. It only came in beige or white or tan. So all the cars pretty much look the same. And then I remember seeing this really nice big black car. Kind of looked like a big Mercedes or something, but it wasn't. It was a Soviet-made car. And so I asked one of the local people about that. And I said, look at that car. I said, that's pretty amazing. I haven't seen it. And he goes, oh, yeah, that's the secret police. I said, well, it wasn't marked secret police, but of course you could tell. And, that's when I realized that the secret police is not a secret who they are or where they are. What's really secret about the secret police is sort of what happens to you if they come and get you. If the secret police take you away, like come in the middle of the night, 2, 3 in the morning, and haul you away and we never hear from you again. Why did they come and get you? Where did they take you? What's going to happen to you? That's what's the secret part about the secret police. And under Stalin, this is called the NKVD, or the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. It was this secret police that it would round up anyone who was speaking illy of unkindly of Stalin. They were not a supporter of Stalin or the communists. They would be could be hauled away, and there were purges that were carried out of any of his rivals. Even high-level communists were not safe. The Great Purge, as it's called, or sometimes the Great Terror of 1936 and 1938. It's estimated that Stalin had 1.2 million of his own people put to death. And of course, there were also gulags. You see this map that's up here. This is the Soviet Union, and every one of those little dark circles there is a camp, is a gulag, a concentration camp. Some of them are out in Siberia. Some of them are more closely in. But these are forced labor camps, and this is where people would be sent. In fact, the numbers show that about 14 million people, Russians, Soviets, were sent to gulags between 1929 and 1953 when Stalin dies. It's 14 million. And of course, add to that there were more than 2.4, just in the year 1953, there were 2.4 million in the gulags at that time. About 500,000 of that were political prisoners. These were just people who politically did not support Stalin in some way. So these were forced work camps. Many people died while they were there because they not executed, but they were worked to death. Stalin was paranoid, and he was paranoid of anyone who might be his rival, probably because that's the way he came to power, through manipulation and doing what he did. And he once said to his closest advisors, "When I die, the imperialists will strangle you all like a litter of kittens." And he did this, of course, to bring fear so that they wouldn't try to get rid of him. They would all be taken over. So this is Stalin, and he becomes the face of communism, certainly in the Soviet Union, and rules it, as you can see, for about 30 years. Now, Stalin will eventually die, and it appears he dies of natural causes, heart attack, something like that. At any rate, it wasn't announced immediately, and there was a lot of infighting who would take over afterwards. And so for about a year and a half, there's a lot of struggles that we won't go through until eventually Khrushchev comes out as the guy in charge. In 1955, Khrushchev knew that the economy was stagnated, that it wasn't doing that well. He wanted to try to boost the economy. He also wanted a lot of change. He opens up the lands in Kazakhstan, for example, to farming, these big collective farms. He thought this might be a boost to the economy. He also began what comes to be called de-Stalinization, to try to remove the excesses of Stalin's era, which he did not agree with Stalin. Of course, he wasn't very open about that at the beginning, but here he wants to remove it. And one of the things he does is denounce Stalin in 1956 in a speech. And he opens up those gulags, and he lets most of those people out who were there to free them. So these are big, big changes. This did not always sit well with all of the other party officials. He also was noted for doing pranks and grandstanding and that sort of thing. This did not sit well with the Politburo or the party officials. For example, he was famous for pounding the table at the UN during a speech that he didn't like. And he pounded his hands. He took his shoe off and pounded the shoe on the table to make noise during the speech. This was not the kind of behavior that was normal in the United Nations, and gained him a reputation that way. He also could be somewhat reckless or pushing things. He sent the U.S. and the Soviet Union to the brink of war in the Cuban Missile Crisis of October of 1962, where basically he sent nuclear weapons and had them installed on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. In fact, these missiles, people knew the range of them. They could hit Washington, D.C. from there. They could hit several large cities on the eastern seaboard. So this came to a showdown when John F. Kennedy was president. Eventually, a blockade was put there by the United States, and the Soviets backed out. But Khrushchev himself was forced out of office by the Politburo in 1964. After this happens, we see Leonid Brezhnev pictured here. The guy's got great eyebrows, right? In 1964 to 1982, he sort of learned from Khrushchev to not be so controversial, to avoid making a lot of radical changes. He reversed some of the most controversial Khrushchev's changes, but the economy just couldn't get going. Even though he rules here, as you can see, not quite for 20 years, but the economy was stagnating. And of course, the problem is that Western culture was sort of threatening to come into the Soviet Union. Artwork, rock music, things like that. They tried to block that and keep all that out because they thought it would corrupt or pollute the culture in the Soviet Union. Conformity was stressed heavily, that everyone should sort of toe the line again. So without incentives, the economy declined. And party members eventually will become the elite, because there was a very, when Lenin came, those who were poor were given all the advantages and those who were rich were subjugated. And so eventually those who are poor become big shots in the party, and they begin to live like the elites. They have the best education, they have the best houses, they have everything the best, and a privileged life. And so this sort of equality thing that Marx had talked about certainly was never seen. Well, we move then to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. After Brezhnev died in 1982, there were two leaders that ended up ruling Russia for about a total of about 3 years. Yuri Andropov ruled for less than 2 years. He died in 1984. He had a lot of health problems, including kidney failure and so forth. After he dies, Chernenko becomes the ruler of Russia. He ruled for only 13 months, dying in 1985. But then another ruler would come that'll see significant changes in the Soviet Union. That's the one pictured here, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was born in 1931 and is still alive today. But he rules Russia or the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991, when in fact the Soviet Union collapses. He made significant changes in those, 6 years or so. One that he called perestroika, which is restructuring. This is basically a way to restructure the institutions and the way things were done within the Soviet Union. He wanted to bring about limited free enterprise to try to boost the economy because their economy was in trouble. He called for glasnost, or openness. Now, this is the idea that people could state their views. They could say, I think this idea would be better than what we're doing, that sort of thing. That was unheard of. And so people and officials were free then to discuss the government and to call for reform. Now, with this openness, with this restructuring, they tolerated some Western music and art and fashion. So things began to change in the Soviet Union. And in fact, Gorbachev himself will allow multi-person elections. They'll be introduced. And up to this point, they had elections, what were called free elections, but you only had one candidate. So who are you going to vote for? This guy or nobody? So that was pretty much your choice. That was your freedom to choose. But he would say there could actually be two candidates, but they're all both from the same party. But eventually he also brings about a new parliament and a two-party political system, where actually the elections could bring about some significant changes. So most of the expression up to this point in the Soviet era had been repressed. Science and academics and so forth, everybody had to follow the party line. You had to make sure you didn't say anything that would disagree with what the Communist Party was talking about. But the one area where you see the most open criticism and a window into this is through literature. There was some literature that was written that was critical of the Soviet Union. For example, Pasternak's novel Dr. Zhivago, which was made into a film, was critical of the sort of cruelty and excesses of the Bolsheviks, of the communists during that period. This won for him a Pulitzer Prize, but of course the government of the Soviet Union would not allow him to go and accept that prize. So this made him in some ways even more famous. And then there was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who in fact was in these work camps, in the gulags, for 8 years. He won a Nobel Prize in 1970, Nobel Peace Prize, for writing One Day in the Life of Ivan Danojevic, which basically tells the story of somebody in one of these gulags and what the life was like there and so forth. It gave a window into how cruel they were and how harsh they were. And your textbook has an excerpt from that writing. He later wrote The Gulag Archipelago, where basically he's talking about how these gulags were tied together like islands, and they would just move people from camp to camp. They sort of had their own culture and their own way of doing things. But these writings were critical of Soviet oppression and the way that the Soviets were operating. By the way, Solzhenitsyn was eventually exiled in 1973. They just wanted to get him out of the country. So that's what they find. He was too famous, I guess, to execute or something, so they kicked him out. So here's the cover of his book, One Day in the Life, and then here's about the Gulag Archipelago. So he becomes really a voice of the gulags, a voice of exposing Soviet oppression, and he becomes kind of a hero in the West, in the United States and elsewhere, where he goes and lectures and so forth, becomes quite well known. Now, why did the Soviet Union collapse? This is our last screen of this talk. The USSR collapses, and you see this map. This map is showing you all the different ethnic groups. I mean, big differences of people. You got Ukrainians, you got Russians, you got Belarusians, right? Belarusians, I guess. You've got people from Kazakhstan and all these other areas down here. You've got other groups, Asiatic kind of groups, Caucasians and so forth. There's just all kinds, Tartars, Turkmen and so forth. There's just all kinds of different people that live here. This is part of the problem. While the Soviet Union is a huge empire, it's an empire which is fragmented by all these different ethnic groups and languages and cultures. So this is one of the factors of their collapse. If you're going to start lightening up the repression, then you're going to have more people wanting, nationalism will grow. The Soviet Union had multiple cultures and languages. One person counted up, said there were 92 nationalities and 112 recognized languages within the Soviet Union. So that's quite a bit to try to maintain. And as the Soviet control weakened, as the Soviet Union weakened, then nationalism of these groups begins to emerge, and this encouraged independence, say, in Chechnya, Chechen rebels and so forth, in different areas. So we see that they start to have all kinds of problems there because of the different religions, languages, and nationalities. The poor economy of the Soviet Union was also pressed and stressed because Ronald Reagan was pushing against the Soviets and pushing the U.S. to develop new kinds of technology and weaponry and so forth. He took a much more aggressive stance. And the Strategic Defense Initiative, which we mentioned in a previous talk, SDI, labeled Star Wars by the press, was basically something that was going to cost a lot of money. It was costing the United States a lot of money, and it was going to cost the Soviets a lot of money. They did not have that money to try to match it. So this put pressure on as well. There's continued pressure. The Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe, which are not pictured on this map, it begins to fail. Places like East Germany and Hungary and so forth. And we see the Berlin Wall, for example, collapsing on November 9th, 1989. Ronald Reagan had gone to the wall and basically told Gorbachev, tear down the wall. He'd done that a few years earlier. But the movement had been to do that. And finally, it actually happened. And in March of 1990, Lithuania declares its independence from the Soviet Union. 1991, Ukraine voted for independence. And Gorbachev resigns in the end of December 1991. And that's, when did the Soviet Union fall? Well, I guess you could say it certainly began to fall late 1989 and certainly completely fell by the end of 1991. And that's where a new ruler will take charge. His name will be Boris Yeltsin. And he will become the president of Russia, not the ruler of the Soviet Union. And so that's what has really created a lot of upheaval since 1990, 1991. We see that all of these territories that the Russians, that were part of the Russian Soviet Union, a lot of them have become independent. There's been a lot of struggle, a lot of jockeying for position. And so we've seen a fairly tumultuous time since then, as the world is still in upheaval, trying to readjust to a lot of new things that have emerged from that. Nationalism, Islamic development, terrorism, and so forth. A lot of that was held in check when you had two superpowers. But now that it's, sort of more of a free-for-all. So we see these are some of the things that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Certainly, Ronald Reagan's policies pushed it, Strategic Defense Initiative, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and of course, we see Mikhail Gorbachev's idea to lighten things up, which basically opens the door for nationalism and a more radical approach. Well, we'll end it there for now.